Hey, it's Samantha from Inbound Add-ons. Just wanted to do a quick tutorial video. This is for a lovely client of mine called Deb. Hey Deb, how you doing? And we were talking about how to implement text messages in multi-countries in order to be able to send text messages in the local time zone of that country. One of the things that HubSpot has for emails is that you can set the email to be sent in the local time zone, whereas for other workflow actions, and in this case in our add-on, HubSpot doesn't give you the option to time those workflow actions, the specific actions, to the local time zone. You can, however, set the times that a workflow is active. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to basically create workflows that will send text messages, for example, to Australia in the Australian business day and to the US in the US business day. So I'm just going to take you through quickly here the structure of what we're doing. So essentially we have a few workflows here. The first workflow is where someone has filled in a form, for example, on your website, and they need to convert. So in other words, they've filled in a form and you want some follow-up actions in order to be able to convert them to a customer. Now in this case, what I recommend is that no matter what time someone fills in the form, that you send an acknowledgement text message straight away, because that's the time at which they are most interested in hearing from you. And even if they're doing it at 11 o'clock at night, to get an immediate response to say, hey, let's say they're in the US and we're in Australia, to get an immediate response and say, hey, we're in Australia, so just so that you know, we'll get back to you as soon as in our next business day. Just want to let you know so that we can manage your expectations, or whatever the text message might say. It's best to acknowledge it right away. But then the follow-up actions, you want to always go in their business day. Or at least during their legal hours for sending text messages. And you need to be aware of that for each country. So what we're going to do here is we'll have one workflow, which is where they've filled in the form, and the enrollment trigger will be that they've filled in a form on the website, and that action will then be to send an immediate acknowledgement. It'd be good if I could spell. Acknowledgement of the form submission, and those settings will be 24/7, but there'll also be a follow-up action there to send the contact to the relevant country follow-up sequence. And what that means is if they're in Australia, you'd send them to the Australian follow-up workflow, and if they're in the US, you'd send them to the US workflow, because that way you can have those workflows timed to be actually executing the actions at certain different times of the day. So then if they're in, so essentially that action is this action here. If the country ID, which in this case for Deb's application, we've created a custom contact property called country ID, and the reason for that is because the HubSpot contact property is actually a free form text field, so you could get people entering USA, America, United States of America, so you don't know exactly what they're going to be entering. So if you use a different custom property called country ID, and then you make that a drop-down select property, you've got a better chance of being able to send them to the right place once they fill in that property. So if they're in country ID Australia, then you send them to the Australian SMS workflow, and if they're country ID USA, you send them to the US workflow. So then that workflow, the Australian SMS follow-up workflow, the enrollment trigger for that is manual, so it's going to be coming from another workflow. The actions are a series of SMS text messages with delays, and the settings will be business days between 9 and 5, for example, which is, so if your HubSpot application is set in the Australian time zone, that'll go through, it'll default to the local time, as in the Australian time, business days between 9 and 5. But if they're a US contact, then the enrollment trigger is again manual because it's being sent from this other workflow. But what you want to do is the actions will be the same, a series of SMS messages with delays, but the settings will be, it'll actually be, I'll show you here how you determine this. It'll be Tuesday to Saturday, because that's based on the Australian local application settings for your HubSpot. On Monday at 9 a.m. in the US, is like 1 a.m. in Australia on Tuesday. So I'll show you how we work that out in a sec. So essentially this is what we need to build. Now I'm just going to go in and actually start building that. So we need to build these last two workflows first, because in order to build the first workflow, we need to be able to point them to these ones, and they need to be already made. So I'm just going to quickly make the Australian one first. So in this workflow, basically you go into workflows, which is basically automation workflows, create a workflow. I'm going to select it's contact-based, start from scratch, create workflow. This is going to be Australian SMS follow-up actions, for example, whatever you want to name it, but make sure you've got the country that you're referring to here. The enrolment triggers are just going to be manual. Click Save. And the action will be to send a text message. So this might add a delay. So you might be waiting 1 day, for example, after they're sent to this workflow. Click Save and then send a text message. So if I scroll down to the bottom here, send SMS text message and hi, contact token, first name, thanks for whatever your follow-up actions are, and you can continue building your follow-up actions here. The key thing about this workflow is that the settings for this workflow are that you might only be sending these messages on business days, which is Australian business days, because your HubSpot local application is set in Australian time, and it might be between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m, for example. Okay. So click Save. So that's essentially this workflow, and then you would turn this workflow on. I'm not going to turn it on for the moment, you get the gist. So then what we want to do is actually clone this workflow, because you'll have built out all your applications in this, and all of your actions in this, and then to save you having to build them all again, you might call this your US SMS workflow. Click Submit. Now all we need to do here is change the settings for when this is going to run. Now the challenge we have here is we've only got the options of business days only or 7 days a week. The problem with that is that if you select business days, then you are likely to be sending messages to the US on Sundays if you select Monday through Friday. Because if you have a look at the time zones, which we'll have a look in a second, our Monday in Australia is the US Sunday. You kind of can't get around that, but at the very least what you can do is change the hours that you're sending this. Alternatively, you could send it every day between business hours, which may be appropriate as well, but you might be better off looking at the business days. So in this case, I'm going to select business days. And the between the hours of. Now what you need to do is work out, well, what are the business hours, for example, of the country that you are sending to, converted to the Australian business hours or the Australian hours. So what I use there is a little tool called World Time Buddy. And you just go to worldtimebuddy.com. And what I do here is I put in Sydney, Australia as my time. And then in the US, you've got obviously a number of time zones ranging from Pacific to Eastern in terms of the range of hours. Now, the challenge with the US is that if you were going to send messages at, say, where are we here, 9 a.m. Eastern, that's actually 6 a.m. Pacific, which may not be very civilized. So if I look at this Monday here, so on a business day Monday, which is what we're saying we're going to send Monday to Friday, essentially what we're doing here is trying to work out, well, when is 9 a.m. Monday at the latest time in the US? So if I look here at Pacific, 9 a.m. is actually 12 p.m. on the eastern in the eastern states, and it's actually 2 a.m. in Australia. Now you might sort of decide that you want to send it from, say, 8 a.m. Pacific at the earliest to, and now the challenge is that after 5 p.m. Eastern is actually 2 p.m. Pacific. So the challenge being that if you don't want to send it after 5 p.m. in the US business hours, then you need to take Eastern as the latest point. Otherwise, you're going to be sending to the US at dinner time and that sort of stuff. So what you're looking at there then is you're saying, okay, well, let's say we go 8 a.m. Pacific to 5 p.m. Eastern. That's essentially 1 a.m. in Australia to 7 a.m. in Australia. So bear in mind that we're talking Monday to Friday. So if I look at the Monday, that's essentially if I go 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., we're looking at basically Sunday if you select Monday to Friday, but you kind of can't get around that. So what we're going to do is we're going to say only send between the hours of 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. And that will make sure that at least it's going through during US business hours. I hope that makes sense. So where are we here? Okay, so what we're going to do here for the US one is we're going to make it between the hours of 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. I think it was. And click save. Okay, so we've got our two workflows. Essentially the actions are duplicated between them. Now we need the workflow, which is the workflow for what happens when we're sending to these workflows. So if I just go back to workflows and I create a new workflow and say create workflow. Okay, so what I need to do here is set my enrollment triggers. So in this case, I'm going to make it my contact form on my website. And click done. Now in my case, I'm also going to set the re-enrollment criteria so that people can re-enroll if they submit the contact form more than once. So I'm going to click done and save. Now this one can actually be 7 days a week, anytime during the day, because we want them to be responded to as soon as that form is completed. What I'm going to do here is add an action which is essentially to decide what message to send based on which country they're in. So if they're in Australia, I'm going to say one thing versus in other countries, then I'll say another thing. So I'm going to add an action and it'll be an if-then branch. And what I'm doing here is saying if the contact property, contact ID, which is the custom property that we created for Deb, is any of Australia, done, save. Then if it is Australia, I'm going to send a text message and I'm going to make it, I'm just copying and pasting from my actual one from my contact form, first name. Okay, so hi, I always put this from inbound add-ons at the start. It helps with brand recognition and saves me from having to use an alphanumeric ID, which means that I can receive replies. So from inbound add-ons, hi, contact name, thanks for reaching out via the contact form on our website. I'll respond to you as soon as possible to answer your query. Cheers, Samantha. So I'm going to click save. Now, if I'm not from Australia, then what I'm going to do is change my message. And this is the message that I'm going to send here instead. So I'm going to just search for this. Oops. Send message. And I'll paste that there. And what I do in this case, just put the contact token in, is say, hi, contact first name, thanks for reaching out via the contact form on our website. I'll respond to you as soon as possible to answer your query. For your information, I'm based in Australia, so there may be a bit of delay in my response due to time zone differences. Just wanted to let you know. So, that's my informal way of letting them know that, most of the messages or follow-up will actually be done later. But in your case, you might change that to say, we'll get back to you during business hours, for example. So I'm going to click save there. Now, the other thing we're going to do here is once that message is sent, I'm going to send this contact into the forward to another workflow. So enroll contact in a workflow. And the workflow I'm going to do is set Australian follow-up actions. Click save, and that'll go into the Australian follow-up actions workflow. And once that's done, essentially it'll send all of those follow-up actions during the Australian day. And if I have a look here, the workflow is turned off that I've actually chosen. So obviously you wouldn't get that error message if you've already turned it on. So I will just do that. And in this case, if it's anything else, I'm going to send it to the US one. Workflow, enroll in a workflow, US, SMS follow-up actions. Click save. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with other countries, then if it's not Australia, you can then say if it's no, then if it is the UK, for example, and then say yes and no, and you can branch down into all the different time zones that you've actually created workflows for. I've only just created them here for the US and Australia. Now, what I'm going to do here is name my workflow. Contact us, follow up. And now, to be able to turn this workflow on, I need to have these two on as well. So I'm just going to go and turn them on. And I'm only enrolling contacts who meet the trigger criteria after turning the workflow on, otherwise everyone will get these messages. So I'll do that. And essentially that's how you do it. Then you'll go and test that workflow by filling in your own contact form and seeing when you actually get your follow-up messages. So that's it. Hope that helps. And if you've got any questions, just let me know. Cheers.